This video is sponsored by the all-new Red Magic 8 Pro gaming phone. If you play games on your phone regularly, this is basically the best phone you can get for that purpose. I know that sounds a little hard to believe, but if you stick around to the end of the video, I'll show you. Alternatively, you can click the link below to check it out for yourself right now. What is happening, nerds? Okay, so I've been teasing I was in Japan last week for a very special, very secret reason, and the title of this video kind of gives it away. But yes, I got to play Final Fantasy XVI, and I got to interview basically the entire senior development team for like an hour. I even managed to sort of low-key offend Yoshi-P, which was definitely a low moment in my career. I'll certainly explain that one later in the video. But first, just some background and particulars about this trip so you know what it was, what I played, what I can talk about, etc. Square Enix did not cover my flights or accommodation for this trip. They offered, but I declined and paid my own expenses. That's nothing against Square Enix, I just prefer to avoid that stuff when at all possible. If I can pay my own way to an event, I will. As a result, this video is in no way sponsored or paid for by Square Enix, and they did not give me any sort of talking points whatsoever. They have not seen this video before it went live. The only thing they asked me not to discuss was some story spoilers I got to see as part of my hands-on time, which is more than reasonable. I wouldn't have shared that stuff anyway. At the same time, I do talk about some stuff in this video that some people may consider spoilers. Square Enix doesn't consider it spoilers, as they'll work it into their trailers, their gameplay reveals, and general marketing blitz, but you may consider it a spoiler. So if you want to go into this experience completely blind, do not watch this video, but if you're okay with minor background stuff being shared, then don't worry, I won't overstep the mark. Square have asked me to state that the footage you are seeing is still in development and not representative of the final product, which again is very standard for preview builds. I will make the point that the footage you are seeing here is not my own captured footage, but rather B-roll provided by Square Enix. Having said that, this is the section I played through, and the footage that they provided is an accurate reflection of my experience. My time at Square Enix HQ began with a 1-hour presentation on the game from Yoshi-P himself, translated by Koji Fox. So as a Final Fantasy XIV fan, I was already fangirling pretty hard at that point. I then got to play 2 hours of the game divided into 3 sections. The first was a simple combat tutorial. The second was set in a castle where I was on the hunt for someone. That culminated in a pretty badass boss battle. The third section was an icon battle where I transformed into Ifrit and did battle with Garuda in what was easily one of the most knock 'em down, drag 'em out style encounters this franchise has ever seen. After that, I got to interview the game's producer, Yoshi-P, the localization lead, Koji Fox, the game's director, Takai-san, and the game's combat designer, Suzuki-san. It was me and another interviewer with that panel for a full hour. It was genuinely fascinating, and I'm so grateful to have been able to have a conversation with these people who are clearly so knowledgeable, so experienced, and so passionate. It was genuinely humbling to meet them face to face. The final thing I will say before I get into this is that I really liked this video game a lot, but it is important to remember that previews are previews, and just because a preview slice of a game is good doesn't mean that the whole thing is going to be good. So we always have to keep our hype in check. At the same time, I think it's perfectly fine to be excited about video games, and I was very excited for this one going into it. Final Fantasy is such an important series of games, and while there's been some big misfires in the PS3 and PS4 era, the series still means a lot to me, especially as someone who's put a lot of time into Final Fantasy XIV. Coming out of that presentation, the hands-on demo, and the interviews that I had, I am more excited for this game than I was before. This is a wildly ambitious entry that seems like not only a direct response to the failures of Final Fantasy XV, but also seeks to leverage so many of the things that have made Final Fantasy XIV so successful. Unsurprising given that this game is effectively led by Final Fantasy XIV's director, Yoshi-P. Interestingly, Final Fantasy XVI also seems to be a response to Yoshi-P's view of the franchise, which he's described as fossilized in the minds of players. He spoke to me about reaching a new generation of gamers who grew up on first-person shooters and GTA, and he says he wants 16 to be the game that restores Final Fantasy to must-buy status. A curious comment when set against the universal success and acclaim of Final Fantasy VII Remake. There are some really big tonal and gameplay shifts here in this package, some of which are sure to displease long-term fans and turn-based purists. This is a full-on, real-time action game. The gameplay has been designed by the guy who did Devil May Cry 5's Combat. There has never been a Final Fantasy game like this except maybe Stranger of Paradise, so yeah, you can guess why this might be a little divisive. But I can tell you right now, I really liked what I played. It was confronting to see a mainline Final Fantasy game so transformed, but when you remember that Final Fantasy games have often been quite restless, refusing to set into familiar categories or buckets, it all starts to make a lot more sense. Final Fantasy XVI is by no means safe. This could all go pear-shaped come launch, absolutely, but for now, I am all in. So for this video, I think it might be good if I recount in chronological order what I heard or played, because I definitely found myself going through a bit of a journey of understanding in the 6 or so hours that I was at Square Enix. I think it'll probably be similar for you as I recount it to you. So the day began in this presentation theater where both Yoshi-P, the game's producer, and Koji Fox, the game's localization director, stood up for what would end up being about a 1-hour walkthrough of the team's vision for the game. Also present in the room was the game's director, Hiroshi Takai, as well as Ryota Suzuki, the game's combat director who joined Square Enix after 25 years with Capcom, where he worked on, among other things, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, Dragon's Dogma, and Devil May Cry 5. So when it comes to action games, this dude knows what the fuck he's talking about. That's important because Final Fantasy XVI is a real-time action game where you control only one character. It is not party-based, it is not turn-based, it is not ATB similar to Final Fantasy VIII or 7 Remake's hybrid ATB model. It is all real-time, which, yeah, is absolutely going to be very confronting for a lot of long-term fans of the series. Yoshi-P spoke at length on this during the presentation, and he introduced it like this. He listed 4 pillars on which the game is built: powerful narrative, a vast ensemble cast, graphical fidelity, and finally, fresh, exciting battles. I'll quote him directly since I actually recorded and transcribed the presentation. Quote, "And finally, and possibly most importantly, has been our dedication to creating fresh, exciting battles. Over recent years, real-time action games have continued their march to become the norm amongst gamers. To keep in step and further evolve the Final Fantasy series, Final Fantasy XVI has stepped away from the traditional command-based battle system more common in the older games of the series and adopted true real-time action controls." End quote. I thought this was a really interesting way to position it because it kind of makes it sound like Final Fantasy is playing catch-up with the rest of the video games industry, and it also doesn't really acknowledge Final Fantasy VII Remake, since the combat there was a really inspired mix of real-time action, ATB, and party commands. I thought that combat system was phenomenal, and I thought it was a bit odd for Yoshi-P not to reference it here. Again, that is something I asked about later on. For now, Yoshi-P would describe a battle system comprised of 2 types of combat. The first is where you play as Clive, harnessing the power of the icons who are the iconic summons from Final Fantasy games past: Ifrit, Shiva, Titan, etc. As Clive comes into contact with these icons, he gains access to their palettes, allowing you to purchase abilities, customize them, and combine them to create truly unique playstyles. Based on the menu I saw, I think there are going to be 8 of these icon palettes available to Clive, but don't quote me on that. The other type of battle you'll engage in are the icon battles, where Clive transforms into an icon and fights another person who has transformed into an icon. These battles are very different from the base combat type, but they still share some familiar DNA, like the ability to dodge, do melee attacks, do ranged attacks, and use special abilities. Interestingly, each of these icon battles are purpose-built from the ground up to have a unique feel to them. The fight we got to experience was between Ifrit and Garuda, and it was meant to feel like a pro wrestling match. And yeah, it absolutely did, except I don't remember pro wrestlers ripping each other's limbs off, but that was certainly something that was happening here. He then spoke about the way party members work, in inverted commas. In previous games, you generally could control your party. Not here. You can only control Clive, but various AI-controlled teammates will fight by your side at various points throughout the game. There is no ability whatsoever to direct them in combat. You know who you can direct though? Your trusty doggo, Torgal. He's by your side from the get-go, and during combat you can press left on the D-pad to bring up his command menu, asking him to do things like attack specific targets or heal you. If that's too much micro, you can actually automate him so he'll attack on his own, and you do this by equipping a special accessory. So this is where we get to the very interesting subject of difficulty in Final Fantasy XVI. You can tell that the dev team are very preoccupied with this issue because they spoke about it at length. Quote, "We understand that this switch to real-time action can be overwhelming and intimidating for some players who are maybe not used to real-time action games. Those players who are more used to turn-based systems, or those players who wish to focus on the story rather than the action. We worked hard to make the game accessible for these fans as well." End quote. Their solution is rather novel. So when you start the game, you have a choice between what's called action-focused mode and story-focused mode. What's the difference between the two of these? The only difference is that story mode will automatically equip a number of accessories that will make combat easier. For example, there's a ring called the Ring of Timely Focus, which massively increases the window allowing you to dodge by slowing down the game. There's the dog automation accessory I mentioned earlier. There's one called the Ring of Timely Strikes, which will essentially use all of your abilities for you so long as you keep spamming the basic attack button. They also said that there was an accessory which will automatically dodge all attacks where possible. So these items actually do take up slots in your very limited accessory pool. I think I saw you can equip a total of 6 accessories, and I believe there are 5 of these difficulty modifying timely accessories to equip. So you will forgo other stats and combat bonuses when wearing this stuff, but you will obviously have a much easier time with combat. The reason they said they did this was because they weren't interested in things like auto battlers or an easy mode. They want people to really interface with the game's systems and feel like they're properly playing the game. These tools allow people to do that while taking the edge off the difficulty. Either way, I do think it's fascinating to see these game makers contend with what they've done here. Even I was not ready for what it was like to play a mainline Final Fantasy game with real-time action combat. It's confronting. I know I've used that word a few times now, but it is. It's a huge shift for the franchise, and it does risk alienating many people who love Final Fantasy for its strategic, turn-based, party-based combat. I don't think everyone is going to like this, but not everyone likes turn-based combat either, so, you know, kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Outside of the combat stuff, Yoshi-P spoke at great length about the world, story, and characters of Final Fantasy XVI. He described their narrative ambition, quote, "To return to Final Fantasy's rich, high fantasy roots, to tell a story about politics, justice, and values, something that would appeal to younger audiences just stepping out into the world, but also older players who've experienced a lot themselves," end quote. One way this is achieved is through the time jumps that Final Fantasy XVI employs. The game tells the story of Clive at 3 points in his life: his teenage years, his 20s, and his 30s, though the teenage years is an extended flashback sequence that sets up the events of the rest of the game. Final Fantasy XVI is set in the world of Valisthea, a world of rival kingdoms who maintain a delicate peace. The world's power is dotted by the mother crystals dotted throughout each kingdom, with some kingdoms more powerful than others due to the density of mother crystals within their borders. These are essentially akin to oil fields, and they are drying up. The resource scarcity is fueling tensions between kingdoms, particularly as they eye a central, neutral kingdom which contains the largest and most powerful mother crystal of all. This delicate peace is maintained by the Icons, powerful elemental forces that any Final Fantasy fan is familiar with. Ramuh, Ifrit, Shiva, Garuda, Bahamut, Titan, Odin, and more. These icons are so powerful that they act as a sort of mutually assured destruction, since any one icon is more than enough to lay waste to an entire kingdom. In Final Fantasy games past, these icons were summons. They were separate from the characters. But here, the icons are embodied in the dominance. People from each kingdom all blessed or cursed with the power of an icon. They can call upon its power during regular combat, just as Clive does, but they can also transform into their icon, ready to do battle at the absolute peak of their destructive power. This whole story setup, I fucking loved it. I was hanging off every word. The geopolitics, the magic, the environmental allegory of the crystals, these dominants and how they are both slave and master to the icons that are their charge. It's just sick. It's really adult, it's dark, it's cool, and Final Fantasy needs to do something like this because this is a very mature franchise at this point in terms of how old it is, and it's nice to see that Square aren't shying away from pitching something at an adult reading level. Yoshi-P would go on to provide details about the major characters in the game, but to be perfectly honest with you, I don't think you should look that stuff up. It's not super spoilery, but it's spoilery enough that I kind of wish I met these characters in-game rather than in a PowerPoint slide or in a YouTube video. So I'll leave that for now, and you can get the introduction to these characters that I wish I could have had. Yoshi-P did say the game contains 11 hours of cutscenes for just the main scenario alone, and that every one of those cutscenes happens seamlessly in-engine. They spoke often about their desire for Final Fantasy XVI to feel like a roller coaster ride, and part of that is the technology supporting it. You will go from exploration to cutscene to combat without any loading screens appearing, and yeah, I experienced this for myself. It's wonderful. Though I will admit that I do miss those super detailed FMVs that Final Fantasies used to produce at key story moments. Those were always incredible. Speaking of exploration, you should know that Final Fantasy XVI is not an open world game, a point Yoshi-P spoke about as well. Quote, Final Fantasy XVI is not an open world game. What does that mean? To bring players a wide variety of environments and tell a story on a truly global scale at the highest quality possible, Instead of creating a truly open world, we selected several areas that we really wanted to focus on and created those in extreme detail. To make all of those in an open world, we would have needed another 10 years in development time, so instead we created this hybrid experience. We have several large areas connected by a world map. These areas are still quite expansive and offer opportunities for exploration, end quote. To me, this sounds kind of like Dragon Age Inquisition or God of War maybe? I don't know, since we couldn't do any exploration during my hands-on session, but that's my guess. To be perfectly honest, I am fine with that. I think we all know the pitfalls associated with most contemporary open world game design. If Yoshi-P and his team want to sidestep all that and just focus on curated spaces, I am 100% down. The presentation finished with a few important notes. Number one, on the topic of performance mode, yes, the game will ship with a performance mode. The build I played was Fidelity, targeting 4K, but apparently there will be a mode that prioritizes frame rate at launch. Square did not provide any specifics on what sort of frame rate or resolution they're targeting for that mode. As an aside, I asked if this was running in the Luminous engine and Square said no. I asked if it was Unreal and they said no. I asked what it was and they refused to say. So yeah, I guess that's something they'll talk about later. They concluded by saying that unless a meteor strikes the office, this game is not getting delayed. I'm unsure if that was a deliberate or accidental Final Fantasy VII reference, but either way, it's nice to know that that June release is essentially set in stone. So that was everything I got from the presentation. What about, playing it? My hands-on time with Final Fantasy XVI began in a brief combat tutorial, which sadly I don't have any footage of here. This was set in those teenage years I mentioned earlier, where Clive, a prince of his realm, is being trained by the Master at Arms. Immediately, combat feels extremely familiar and intuitive. You can lock on to a specific target with L1, but I mostly used free cam. There's a dodge button bound to R1, and dodging at the last possible second will trigger a witch time effect, slowing down combat and giving you a nice big attack window. Your basic attack is bound to square and it will dish out a simple 4-hit combo. There's also a jump button bound to X. After that, things start to get more specific to whichever icon palette you have equipped. You can have 3 icons equipped at once and cycle between them instantly. Each one gives you a specific movement ability bound to circle. So for example, when I have Phoenix equipped, I will dash forward, but if I have Garuda equipped, I'll actually pull my target towards me. Similarly, there's an icon-specific ranged ability bound to triangle, so for Phoenix, that's a fireball. Doesn't do a lot of damage, but it can be worked into your melee combo for a longer combo string that will also buff magic damage for each successive hit. These abilities are where things get really interesting, but I didn't have access to many of them in this combat tutorial, only one of Phoenix's, which was a sort of fire uppercut, very satisfying, big damage. This is also where you learn about the stagger mechanic. If you can deal enough successive damage to a target, you will break their poise, or whatever it's called, and they will enter a staggered state. At that point, you can just wail on them and they can't do anything about it. What also happens here is that each successive attack while they're down does more damage, so you're essentially incentivized to hit them very hard and very fast, saving your big cooldowns for these moments. So that was the combat tutorial, and then it was on to the main block of gameplay, which is what you're seeing here. Clive and his buddy are in a castle trying to root someone out. It starts in the pitch black darkness, but with a bit of fancy fire magic, I'm able to light the way forward and off we go. This is probably a good time to talk about visuals. Final Fantasy XVI is a really good looking video game. You see it here in these lighting effects, but unfortunately this level we played through is very dark, so it's not the best showcase. Contrast that with this segment, where I'm pursuing a hooded figure while Garuda taunts me. The density of the vegetation, the particle effects, the terrain destruction, it's all absolutely superb, and all of this was running in-engine, real-time, no trickery whatsoever. Looking at other trailer footage and seeing what we're in store for, I'm very confident that Final Fantasy XVI is going to be a looker. I will say though that the motion blur was kicking in really hard whilst playing, and it was terrible. The build was not finalized, and I don't know how much optimization has gone into it versus what will be in the final product, but yeah, the motion blur was so bad that there's no way in hell I would be playing the 4K mode. I would definitely be turning on the performance mode if the final product is anything like this, but to be fair, I would just always turn on performance mode anyway, since I always value frame rate. Just briefly on the PS5's adaptive triggers, they don't seem to be utilized during combat, but they are used in certain QTE events like this opening of the gate.
your leisure, Clive.
Entering combat is just as Yoshi-P promised. Totally seamless, no loading screens or whatever. Enemies are just standing there in a room and you can immediately ambush them, and then it's on like Donkey Kong. They appear in fairly big numbers as well. Most encounters had at least 5 enemies, sometimes up to 10. There were mini-boss encounters which were one-on-one or featuring one mini-boss flanked by some low-level goons. This is where we can talk about those icon abilities. You can equip 3 icon palettes at a time, and within that you can equip 2 abilities for each icon. There are multiple abilities to choose from within each icon palette, so already you can see the foundation here for the customization framework. You use your abilities by holding R2 and then pressing either square or triangle. You can then press L2 to cycle to the next icon palette so that you can then use those abilities. There's a handy little UI thing in the bottom right corner showing you which abilities are currently on or off cooldown, and I use this a lot. It's a great feature. The abilities are really distinct and absolutely lean into the identity of each icon. Phoenix does these large arcing AoE attacks. Garuda has this attack that will spin up into the air, allowing you to set up for air juggle combos, as well as a focused Talon Rip that will chain multiple hits against a single target. Titan's moves were probably my favorite. You hold down the button and a radial dial appears, and if you release at the exact moment, you'll do bonus damage, and then Clive will make a very satisfying grunting sound. What's not quite clear to me at this point is the exact role of basic and ranged attacks versus abilities. What I mean by that is I very much found myself kind of cooldown dumping, cycling through my available abilities and using them as soon as I could, and then reverting back to basic attacks only when needed. I'm not sure if those basic attacks buff the ability damage, if I combo them together with abilities or whatever, I don't know. That's my guess, but I don't know for sure. I will say that the game felt quite easy. I actually took off all of those game assisting accessories as soon as I started playing, and even then I didn't struggle with combat in the slightest. I found the dodge window to be very generous. I found enemy health and damage output to be more than reasonable. I found enemy telegraphs to be clear and their movesets easy to contend with, and I found executing combos and abilities very simple. This section of the game was 5 hours in, so we're still early game here, but yeah, without a dedicated hard mode, I do wonder if hardcore action fans might find this a little too easy mode for their tastes. One thing that might appeal to those sorts of players is a scoring system that kicks in for mini bosses and main bosses. Similar to something like Bayonetta or Devil May Cry, you'll get a score for performing well during an encounter, and the higher your score, the more experience or item drops you'll get, which is a nice touch. So I progressed through this castle until I got to the first of 2 boss fights. This one was against 2 Garuda-like enemies who I fought at the same time, and the fight was awesome because it had these mechanics that really reminded me of Final Fantasy XIV, where the floor kind of telegraphs what's coming and you need to dodge out of the way. It was a really aerial encounter that made great use of Phoenix's ability to teleport forward and up to a target if they're airborne. There was also these quick time events asking me to dodge or strike at specific moments, which is gimmicky, sure, but they looked hella cool and it just added to the spectacle of it all. This was just a basic, non-story climactic boss encounter 5 hours in, and yeah, it felt so much bigger and more elaborate than what I would have expected. And this boss fight was then followed up by another fight straight after, this time with one of the dominants themselves channeling Garuda's power, but not actually transforming into Garuda. Again, it was an absolutely brilliant showdown, all the while Masayoshi Soken's music blaring in the background. And look, for those of you who have never played Final Fantasy XIV before, that name's not going to mean anything to you, but if you have played Final Fantasy XIV before, that name is everything, because during his time with 14, he has created one of the most iconic catalogs of music across all of video games. He is scoring Final Fantasy XVI, and yeah, man, this guy's just a fucking genius.
I'll kill you! I'll kill you, Paul!
This battle concluded with some melodrama, and I guess it's a good opportunity to talk about narrative, tone, and voice talent in Final Fantasy XVI. After I interviewed localization director Koji Fox, I went up to him to thank him for his work on Final Fantasy XIV, because one of the reasons that game works as well as it does here in the West is that it has an absolutely flawless localization. Not just a straight translation, but almost like an adaptation that includes turns of phrase or idioms that only work in English, and a lot of that stuff can be attributed to him. We got to talking, and he told me that while the script was written by someone else in Japanese, someone named Kazutoyo Maehiro, Koji Fox was sitting next to him while he was doing it, and they were constantly having this back and forth. Koji then translated the final script into English, and he then personally led the motion and lip sync capture sessions, which were conducted in English. After that, the in-game lip sync was done for cutscenes, and then the Japanese audio dub was recorded, and they were making changes to the script so that the Japanese voice lines would better fit the English in-game lip sync. So you have a Japanese script translated to English and then translated back to Japanese to fit an English lip sync. That is not how I imagined this process would work, but based on what I've seen so far of the narrative and the voice performances, I think I'd say it's a process that's paying very big dividends. The last gameplay segment I got my hands on was this icon battle. Here Clive pursues a hooded figure but is ambushed by Garuda, who he fights in his regular-ass Clive form. Even this part of the fight was super fun though, with some truly incredible animations on Garuda and again, more top-shelf music from Forspoken. Clive scores a few big hits, lops off a few extremities and thinks he's won the day when suddenly Garuda pops back up and she's like, I can do this all day. At this point, Clive goes Super Saiyan. Clive is now transformed into legendary fire elemental Ifrit, and as the camera shifts over Ifrit's shoulder, you get a sense of the size and scale of these icons. This battle has a lot of kaiju energy, not surprising at all given that icons can be as large as 150 meters tall. The combat here is much simpler than Clive's human form, but that's okay because the battle here is ultimately about bombastic spectacle, and it absolutely delivers. The way you leap toward Garuda, punch and kick the shit out of her, knock her to the ground and drag her, rip her damn limbs off. It's that wrestling match that Yoshi-P spoke of earlier, but again, a reminder that each of these icon battles has been designed differently to elicit a different feel each time. At the end of the fight, Ifrit is victorious, but it's clear that Clive is no longer in control of him, forcing his friend to intervene and settle him down.
Stop this! Now! Stop!
How fucking cool was that? So that was my hands-on time with the game, and as I said, I loved it. I think it looks spectacular, both in its technical detail and its art design. I think the music is superb, but I wouldn't expect any less from Forspoken. I think the dialogue and voice work is excellent. I think the combat is accessible, yet clearly has a lot of flexibility and depth, and I think the boss encounters were epic. I really didn't have much criticism at this point, but I did have questions, and that brings us to the Q&A block, where I got the chance to sit down with most of the senior development team, and here's how it went. Spoiler alert, not great. So I remember during Yoshi-P's presentation that he said the action game genre had advanced and was now the norm. So my first question to him was he implying that JRPGs hadn't advanced in the same way? I could tell immediately that he did not love the phrasing of that question. I could hear him mention the term JRPG over and over again, and I was kind of waiting for the translation from Koji Fox to come back. Koji said, quote, "One thing he wants to get across is that when we create games, we don't go into them thinking we are creating JRPGs. We are just creating RPGs. The term JRPG is used by Western media rather than users and media in Japan," end quote. This made a lot of sense, of course, but we discussed a little more because I could tell that he wasn't comfortable with that term. And then he said something really fascinating. Quote, This is going to depend on who you ask, but there was a time when this term first appeared 15 years ago, and for us as developers, the first time we heard it, it was like a discriminatory term, as though we were being made fun of for creating these games. And so for some developers, the term JRPG can be something that will maybe trigger bad feelings because of what was in the past. It wasn't a compliment to a lot of developers in Japan. We understand that recently JRPG has better connotations and it's being used as a positive, but we still remember the time when it was being used as a negative, end quote. I was so stunned by this because I had never heard this before. To me, the term JRPG was sort of as agnostic as ARPG or CRPG. It was a shorthand descriptor that summarized a set of characteristics associated with a certain type of RPG. The way we'd call Xenoblade a JRPG, but we wouldn't call Elden Ring a JRPG, despite the fact that they were both RPGs made in Japan. But clearly, for Yoshi-P, this shorthand had a lot of baggage. Quote, I remember seeing something 15 years ago which was basically a definition of what a JRPG was versus a Western RPG, and it's kind of like Final Fantasy VII, and it has this type of graphics, this length of story, and compartmentalizing what we were creating into a JRPG box. And I took offense to that because that's not how we go into creating. We were going in to create an RPG, but to be compartmentalized, we felt that was discriminatory, end quote. So fascinating, right? That is one of the most successful RPG makers of all time, working in the company that basically invented the JRPG as we refer to it today, saying that the term JRPG was kind of offensive. That was such an eye-opening exchange. Anyway, I think this speaks to Yoshi-P's desire to not have his games be put in narrowly defined boxes. Final Fantasy XIV is a really good example of that, with its very unique spin on the MMORPG formula. Final Fantasy XVI is clearly another, with its move to real-time combat. I asked Yoshi-P about that move and why he felt it was necessary. Quote, traveling around the world, speaking with fans and media about their image of the franchise, they would always give the same answer, that it's turn-based, that it's anime-like, these teenagers saving the world, very JRPG in inverted commas. This was the image for all of Final Fantasy. This was turning off some players because they thought it could only be that, and that was a reason to not get into it. On top of that, you have a generation of new gamers who were raised on first-person shooters and games like Grand Theft Auto, where input is always direct. For those players, the thought of having to wait before you act is kind of a disconnect for that young generation. So with our goal to expand the series and broaden the audience, bring back players but also welcome new players, we realized that we had to evolve the series and change it up from what people expected, end quote. Again, I found this so interesting to know that Grand Theft Auto has directly influenced Final Fantasy XVI, but also because it implies that he doesn't think the innovations present in Final Fantasy VII were enough to shift people's perceptions of what this franchise is or could be. My final question to him was, what would you like people to say about this game 5 years from now, both as a standalone experience and as part of the Final Fantasy franchise? Quote, what I want is for players to say, wow, that it blew them away. Wow can be perceived in different ways. Wow because of story. Wow because of lots of crazy boss battles. Wow because whoever made this must have been out of their minds. What we want is for players to have that sense of wow. As for its place within the franchise, hopefully through Final Fantasy XVI, we can kind of regain that sense of the Final Fantasy series is a must-buy. You must check this out. Something that we don't have now. And we can return to the idea that when a Final Fantasy comes out, it is something that we must play, end quote. I thought that was fascinating because personally, I think Final Fantasy is a must-play, especially after 7 Remake. But obviously, Yoshi-P doesn't agree. And I think a lot of the big, bold plays that we're seeing here in 16 can be explained by this hunger that Yoshi-P has. He doesn't see Final Fantasy as the preeminent RPG franchise with a lot of incumbency, something guaranteed success or entitled to your dollars or playtime. He sees it as something kind of aging, fossilized in the minds of players, a little bit outdated compared to contemporary offerings. And he's not happy with that. That is why there are no sacred cows, whether it's the narrative tone or the technology they're using or gameplay. Everything is on the table for Yoshi-P and his team. Will long-standing fans of the Final Fantasy franchise agree with his assessment and his interventions? That remains to be seen. But for me personally, I am more than impressed with what I've seen and more than willing to just hop on that roller coaster and see what's in store. I am quietly confident that it's going to be a very good ride. While I was in Japan, I brought this bad boy with me, the all-new Red Magic 8 Pro gaming phone. So this phone is actually kind of a big deal if you regularly play games on your phone. Personally, I do. Right now, my current obsession is Marvel Snap, but I still dabble in Wild Rift when I have the time. I play Crash Royale until I get too tilted and uninstall it again. Plus, I'll sometimes play mobile ports of indie titles, stuff like Into the Breach or Gris. Bet you didn't know that one had a mobile port. Point is, we dunk on mobile games a lot because a lot of them suck, but a lot of them are good. And if you want to enjoy mobile games to their fullest potential with a phone purpose-built to play games, then this is the phone for you. This thing is sporting a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 for the fastest load times and smoothest performance while playing. You know what else it's got? Fan. Most phones throttle down performance as the phone heats up, negatively impacting gameplay, but the Red Magic 8 Pro's inbuilt fan cools the internals, allowing you to squeeze every drop of performance out of its hardware. It has configurations going up to 512GB of storage and 16GB of RAM, and it's got a 120Hz AMOLED screen providing up to 1300 nits worth of brightness. That is a lot, by the way. This is one of the brightest screens on the market, and it's running at 120Hz, so it looks super smooth while doing it. Interestingly, it has actual shoulder buttons, which can be mapped in certain games, one of the very few phones to support that feature, and it features a dedicated game mode launcher, allowing you to essentially use the phone as you would a handheld console, providing an experience that keeps everything focused on the games. Outside of this, it's also just a great phone that I've really enjoyed using. Battery life is excellent, and it comes bundled with a 65-watt fast charger, allowing you to charge from 0 to 100% in just 43 minutes. It's got a 50-megapixel camera for fantastic photos, and it just looks cool with a nice back design and a little bit of RGB flair. You probably haven't heard of this phone before, so you're thinking to yourself, what's the catch? There really isn't one. If you look around online, you will find plenty of reviews for this thing, and they are all positive. It's a really impressive piece of kit at a very reasonable price, and if playing games on your phone is something you do on the reg, then I'd encourage you to at least take a look at it. I've left a link to the product page below, so click the description or the pinned comment to check it out. Thanks Red Magic for sponsoring the video, and thank you for watching it.